Good day, denizens et al. So today we finish up contact commerce and colonization, looking at the second part, and the Europeans colonizing the Americas, taking out the Americas. And we talked previously in the first half of contact commerce and colonization about the Europeans just beginning overseas exploration, starting with the Portuguese and reaching over into the Indian Ocean. But today we focus in on the Americas and how the Europeans come in and obliterate that. And here's a really pretty picture depicting the Bahamas, where Christopher Columbus, of course, is going to land in October of 1492. Okay, so overall, just to give you an overall broad picture here, we're going to see what we label here the Atlantic world, and we label it that because you might recall the first major long-distance trade network started with the Silk Road, going all the way back to around the year 100 CE with the Han Dynasty, really supplementing and facilitating that across Central Asia. And then later on, we see another overland route develop across Sub-Saharan Africa, the Trans-Saharan Trade Network. But as technology increases and Islam spreads across Central Asia and into places like modern-day India, trade begins to flourish in the Indian Ocean and is extremely valuable. As a matter of fact, that's what the Europeans wanted to get to. But when Columbus accidentally lands in the Americas, this changes quite a few things, because what was the richest area on the planet for trade, the Indian Ocean, is going to, over the course of 100 to 200 years, is going to flip to this new Atlantic system of exchange, where the most profitable area on the globe is going to be a triangular system between the Americas, Europe, and Africa. Okay, so basically what the Europeans are able to do with this Atlantic world is they're going to be able to develop a set of sea lanes from Europe to the Americas. In other words, lanes for trade. Basically, just imagine as being like, a new highway system going across, a stretch of area that didn't exist before. And this is going to begin really a new phase of world history. And the reason why the Europeans are able to so successfully take out the Americas, the number one reason easily, is the disease. Diseases are going to wipe out the indigenous native populations of the Americas. They stand no chance against European smallpox. The Europeans don't know this, nor do the Americans, obviously. But nonetheless, this is what's going to attribute, or this is the reason why we're going to see the Europeans so easily take out amazing empires like the Inca and the Aztecs. And eventually labor shortages, because basically European disease wipes out 90% of the peoples in the Americas within about 50 years. The Europeans begin to turn to slave labor, and that slave labor is going to come from Africa and initiate the African slave trade coming over to the Americas. We'll talk about that more in depth here in a few minutes. And of course, with the Europeans now competing with each other, that's going to create these major rivalries, especially after 1517, when Martin Luther leads the Protestant Reformation, when at that juncture we're going to have, of course, Protestant and Catholic European countries, Protestants being like the English and the Dutch, Catholic being Spanish, Portuguese, the French, all competing to spread their version of the gospel. But of course, other motivations include gold, wealth, and of course, power. Okay, so European navigation and conquest. Remember, the Portuguese, they're down in Benin on the western coast of Africa by the 1480s. And remember, by the late 1480s, they're also over into the Indian Ocean. By 1497, 5 years after Columbus, they'll establish a complete trade network because of Vasco da Gama with India. And eventually the Portuguese are actually shipping slaves from Africa to work on sugarcane plantations just off the coast of Western Africa. And basically, the Portuguese and the Spanish, in order to continue to expand their trade network and get to the Indian Ocean, they want to eliminate the people in the middle who are charging them. The Italians charging taxes for trade, the Muslims, especially the Ottoman Empire, charging a tax for trade, or just not allowing the Europeans to trade at all. It's important to quickly talk about, though, how slavery worked. Slavery in Africa existed well before the Europeans ever got there. Islamic empires had enslaved folk, African kingdoms and cultural groups had enslaved folk. But the thing is that it was different. African slavery was not necessarily a death sentence as it will be for the Europeans. With African slavery, typically you were enslaved like if you were a prisoner of war, but if you were a criminal, or if you owed a huge debt. So in other words, your time to be enslaved was terminal. So you might be enslaved for, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, but you know that eventually you will be set free once you work off your debt, and so on. And two, even as a slave, you actually had pretty well-defined rights in many of these Western African kingdoms. You could own your own property, you could get married, and you could even pay to acquire your freedom. African slaves under the Europeans in the New World are not going to have any of these options. As a matter of fact, slaves in the New World under European rule will not even be seen as human beings. They are viewed as a commodity, a means to an end to make profit for the Europeans. And from 1450 to about 1500, you see 100,000 African slaves transported to Spain and Portugal from Africa. But eventually, by the 1500s, slaves will be transported to the Caribbean by the Europeans. And the big number one reason they're transported to the Caribbean is to procure sugar. The Europeans have a major, major sweet tooth. Well, as we all probably know, and if not, we're about to, Christopher Columbus is the guy who's going to lead this way to the Europeans stumbling across the Americas. Chris Columbus had some funny ideas, though, as you can read down there, Columbus's memory globe theory. But nonetheless, Christopher Columbus was convinced that if he simply went to the west, instead of trying to go around Africa, if you just went west, you could get to Asia, to Japan and India and China. And back then, the Europeans viewed all of Asia basically as the Indies, as they would have called it. So, for example, Columbus thought when he first landed, he landed in Japan, but more broadly, he would have thought of, okay, I'm in India, right? So thus he calls the people Indians. Just like if you were sailing across the Pacific and you landed in California, right? You would say, I landed in California, but more broadly, I landed in the United States today, right? But nonetheless, people around the world, well, especially Europeans, I guess, questioned Columbus's ideas. Columbus thought that the Earth was really about 1/5 smaller than it actually is. And, any contemporary of the time, in other words, people who existed the same time he did, who was educated, knew that he was underestimating the size of the globe. But Christopher Columbus was a pretty hard-headed guy. But nonetheless, even to his dying day, you see Columbus dies in 1506, even to his dying day, he will say that he did not discover new lands, that he actually landed in Asia. And when Columbus lands, he lands somewhere we believe, in the Bahamas. And his first goal when he comes across these people, he views them as primitive, simpletons. They're not Christian, so therefore they're heathenistic and they need to be Christianized. But Columbus also wanted to make some money, and when he sees that they have gold, he is just further encouraged to try to keep tracking down more profit and more treasure. And obviously Columbus is going to receive his support from the Spanish, talk about in class, but the Catholics in Spain. Columbus is actually Italian, probably Genoese, so he's from Italy, what is today Italy. But he's receiving monetary support from Ferdinand and Isabella over in Spain, who had just reconquered and reunited most of Spain, running out the Moors, or the Muslims. And they were willing to take a risk on this guy Columbus to see if they could establish some trade networks and make some more money. So obviously, Columbus then wanted to make money not only for himself, but also, to give back money to the people who had paid him or loaned him money and whatnot. Problem is, nobody knew that there were about 3,000 miles of ocean and 2 continents in the way to Asia. Well, people suspected that, obviously that the Earth was much larger, but nobody knew about the continents of the Americas, save for, of course, the Americans. But nonetheless, Columbus expected to find India and Indians, and believed until his dying day that he had found just that. On October 12th of 1492, he arrived in the Bahamas. He kept going on after that, landing in what is today Haiti and the Dominican Republic, what they would have called Hispaniola back then, and into Cuba. He actually even brought some natives back to Spain to convert to Christianity. But eventually, another guy who's going to go on various journeys to the New World, a guy named Amerigo Vespucci, is actually going to discover that indeed these are two entirely new continents of which the Europeans were not aware. You can see where Columbus first landed there. In the Bahamas, and then the blue arrow pointing to Hispaniola. Hispaniola is going to become, it says the first center of Spanish New World trade, but it's going to be the center of American trade, especially Haiti. Haiti is going to become really the most valuable of all of these colonies in the Caribbean, really in the Americas throughout the 15 and 1600s. And it's going to be widely sought after, highly sought after by the European powers, mostly because of its ability to grow sugar, which the Europeans bring over from India. There was no sugar in the Americas before the Europeans brought it. But later on, the Europeans will come across an even more addictive commodity known as tobacco, which they will also begin growing in Haiti, among other places. The English will eventually grow it in North America as well and make a fortune. And this also becomes a big commodity. Throughout all this time, though, sugar will remain the top commodity. Sugar is the most valuable commodity. And then tobacco, later on rice, indigo, some of these things. And of course, sadly, slaves themselves, who the Europeans view not as human beings, but they view African slaves as commodities, no different than sugar. And it's important to point out too that during this time when the Europeans arrive, North America is very sparsely populated. It's very diverse with a lot of remarkable groups of Native American groups, but the vast majority of the population lives in Latin America once the Europeans arrive. And there is good old Amerigo Vespucci. He is America's namesake. It is named after this guy. I still think they should have named it Vespucci, though, instead of after Amerigo, but what are you going to do? But this is the guy who, came to understand that, hey, wait a second, these are two totally new continents that we have found. And not only that, but later on, German cartographers will actually, map makers, will begin to label these two new lands as the Americas. And of course, word of Columbus's discovery is going to spread rapidly because, 50 years before, this dude, Johannes Gutenberg, had come out with the printing press. So we had this kind of, mass production to an extent of printed materials. So, literacy rates had really gone up in Europe because of the printing press, and people's curiosity had been piqued. So when all this new stuff is, obviously, people want to know more. And, Columbus's journeys become widely known across Europe, at least amongst the learned population. And obviously, people want more. So the Spanish really developed one of the first really major empires in the Americas. The Spanish just develop a really powerful American empire from which they will make an ungodly amount of money. Who knows even to this day how many billions and billions of dollars, in today's money, maybe trillions, that they pulled out of the Americas. But nonetheless, the Spanish, like other European civilizations, believed that their culture was superior to the native cultures. The Spanish, like the Portuguese or even the English later on, the French, they believed that, Christianity had to be taught to these natives who were not Christian in order to save their souls. But at the same time, the Spanish believed that enslaving them actually was a version of setting them free, putting them in work in the name of the faith and teaching them in the correct ways. And of course, a lot of this was based around not Christianity at all, but avarice and greed, which of course, no Christian, no true Christian would ever, fall to or believe in. But nonetheless, sadly, this is how the Europeans rolled. They believed that this was a way to interpret and use Christianity, sadly. Not only that, but they received a royal decree or an official religious decree from the Pope himself to spread Catholicism. So the Spanish, they feel even further empowered. They have this kind of missionary zeal, right? That they have this obligation to spread Catholicism. Saying, well, these natives, they're too violent, they're heathenistic, right? They don't have a faith. They need to be civilized with Christianity. But the Spanish are just really, really brutal. But so will be, the English and the French and the Portuguese and the Dutch. They're all just pretty brutal. But at least the Spanish, by 1542, they're actually going to pass what are called the new laws, and they'll actually forbid native slavery. Reports will start to come out about how some of these human beings are treated in the Americas. And the Spanish will be one of the first to say, okay, what we've been doing here for the last 50 years is wrong. And a lot of people have died, and we need to change our ways to an extent. Sadly, it's going to be too little too late. The Spanish do set up a major civilization, though. They actually set up the first permanent European settlement in Santa Fe, modern-day New Mexico, amongst the Pueblo peoples. So technically, Santa Fe is the oldest capital in the United States, ironically. And the Spanish, too, unlike the English and the French, the Spanish set up this urban civilization, this civilization that revolves around more city-type living, whereas the English come in, they pretty much just set up these large agrarian plantations in North America, for example, the English. And they'll have like Jamaica and places like that, too. And then the French, they later on will establish some formal colonies, but the French pretty much are just these kind of traders and exchangers. They really established an immense fur trade, especially in the Americas, and eventually they'll take over Canada. So the Spanish are really driven by this search for wealth, right? They want gold, they want silver, they want spices, they want to control the sugar trade. But also, this idea of glory and to spread Catholicism. But some of the first Spanish to come over are these conquistadors, these conquerors. A guy named Hernan Cortez is going to conquer the Aztecs by the 1520s. Another really conquistador as well, Ferdinand Magellan, is going to be the first to actually sail around the world. His Spanish group of ships will actually make it all the way around the planet for the first time, circumnavigating the globe, although Magellan's not going to survive it. He dies, I believe, in the Philippines. And Francisco Pizarro is going to conquer the Inca, and we'll talk about some of his perfidy in conquering the Inca. And the Spanish basically get these huge ships, these so-called galleons, that just carry loads and loads of gold and silver over to the Spanish Empire. And of course, because of all that gold being out there, that encourages some pirates to then try to capture those treasures. And a lot of times these pirates were hired by the English to go out and sink these Spanish vessels, because the English view the Spanish, obviously, as competitors. And eventually the Spanish government itself will replace the conquistadors, who were just brutal, with lawyers, bureaucrats, governing officials to oversee their empire, especially after the new laws are passed, to try to turn back the tide of the brutality of the conquistadors. And yeah, the conquistadors, they used every means necessary to try to take over these empires, and we'll check that out with Pizarro and Cortez taking over these respective Native American empires. And they come in with weaponry and superior weaponry, obviously, with guns. But the real reason that the Spanish are able to so easily take over amazing civilizations like the Aztecs and the Inca is because of disease. The Spanish and other European powers bring in, and they don't know they're bringing it in, but they bring in smallpox. And the Americas, people in the Americas had no experience. Smallpox had never existed in the Americas. So once that's introduced into the ecosphere, that's going to be all she wrote for, sadly, tens of millions of Native Americans. And on top of that, the Aztecs had created, for example, a lot of enemies. So it's easy for the Spanish to work with, enemy groups of the Aztecs and have them join with the Spanish to take out the Aztecs. And interestingly, originally, the Aztec ruler Montezuma, who's going to be killed by his own people eventually, he feared that good old Hernan Cortez was actually Quetzalcoatl, who was the great Aztec god. But the reality is that Aztecs mostly died of disease. And the Spanish established just this amazing empire, and just gazillions of dollars worth, that's an official term, of silver and gold are going to go into the Spanish coffers, the Spanish accounts. But a lot of Spanish gold and silver is going to be at the bottom of the ocean as well because of pirates and conflict, especially with the English. Nonetheless, the Spanish, their empire being so large, you can see where their gold and silver mines were located. Their empire being so large, they'll actually have a coin called the peso de ocho, which was the value of 8 reals. Real means royal. This actually becomes the first international currency. There'll be peso de ochos all around the planet because of the Spanish global exchange network that they'll set up. And this is just remarkable. This comes to be called the Columbian Exchange, not by them, but by we historians, by us. Nonetheless, you can see here, so whatever you see coming out of the Americas there at the top of the screen, none of those things ever existed in Afro-Eurasia. So when those things come over to the Europeans, maize or corn, vanilla, cassava, tobacco, peppers, sweet potatoes, avocado. I don't really like avocado. Pumpkin, pineapple, none of those things existed in Eurasia until after 1492. And then the same goes for the Americas where we live, right? There was no coffee here at all. It's brought over because of European trade. There was no sugar here. Of course, there were no horses here. There were no pigs here. There were no cattle or sheep here. And I'm starting to think about a good steak place, but nonetheless, even more importantly though, and catastrophically, there was no flu here. There was no whooping cough, typhus, measles, and even worse, there was no smallpox here. All of those things are brought over because of the European exchange system that's going to wipe out Native Americans. And I always like to point out too, there were no dandelions here. Every year, do you know how much dandelions cost me? Nonetheless, so basically what comes to be called what historians call this Columbian Exchange is just this transatlantic flow of goods and people, right? Plants, animals, cultures that had not been in contact with each other for centuries. And of course, for people in Native America, the Vikings had landed up in, northern North America, up in what is today Canada. But the reality is that really for 25, 30,000 years, there have been, no contact between these two peoples, but now all of a sudden they're in complete contact with each other. And Europeans are going to bring livestock, wheat, rice, sugarcane, but also disease. And just think about that. There were no cows, no horses, no pigs in the Americas. And in Eurasia, there was no corn, no tomatoes, no potatoes, no peanuts. How can you watch a baseball game? There was no tobacco, no cotton. So all of a sudden, all these things coming over to the new or to the old world are going to help grow the populations there as well, because now all of a sudden you have all these new types of foods coming into Eurasia, into China or France or England or Germany, or even sub-Saharan Africa, these things that can be grown, which is going to mean more food supplies, which is going to mean more people. Prior to European arrival in the Americas, we don't really know for sure, but there were probably about 50 to 60 million people in the Americas. Maybe anywhere from 2 to 10 million in what is today the United States. But the real thing to point out here is that within 50 years, within 50 years, 90% of those people are dead because of European disease, but also, the Europeans killing them through war as well. But really it's disease and military power, the advanced technology of the Europeans that bring down major empires like the Aztec and the Inca. But realistically, had they not had the disease, the Aztec and Inca were pretty powerful empires. I think they probably could have held off the Europeans. Maybe, maybe not. And just some of these major commodities that are going to come around. Sugar is going to remain the #1 commodity throughout. But by the 1600s, tobacco will be added to that as a major commodity. And then, of course, by the 1800s, cotton will be added in there, especially with the Industrial Revolution and the need for textiles, cloth. So what is the overall impact? Well, you do have a huge influx now of gold and silver coming into Eurasia, right? There is such a thing as too much gold and silver, which is going to cause inflation. And so basically, you're going to see the economies like in Spain, the economy in Spain become inflationary, meaning that the value of money is going to decrease, which means you have to charge more for products. So the economy and people is going to struggle. People are going to struggle to buy things and sell things. And especially in China, China is going to see a huge influx of silver because the Ming Empire decides to start using silver coinage. So the Europeans, much of that silver out of the Americas is actually going to find its way to China, which is going to make China very rich, but also eventually inflate their economy as well. And all these new products coming across the continents, the heated rivalries between the European powers, all of these major impacts. And then once labor begins to run out in the Americas, the Europeans then turn to slavery from Africa. And the overall significance of all of this, the population is just going to explode in Eurasia, India, China, Europe, because of all these new American crops, these new American foods. That being said, 90% of the people in the Americas will be wiped out. Cultures destroyed, people destroyed because of European disease and military conflict. And Europeans, look, I mean, they just go to war to try to control human and material wealth in the Americas. That's really what it comes down to. We're going to control human bodies. We're going to control money. That's the whole idea. And the Europeans, by default, create a market for their own goods, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And the Americas will eventually become a staple producing province for the Europeans. And by the 1600s, tobacco will become this huge commodity that'll make billions for the English once they get into this game by the 1600s. So we'll take a look at some of these focus questions later on, but that's all we got for now. Thanks for tuning in.